I think the words that best describe DFI capital is it's patient capital, it's very purpose-driven capital. Is there an opportunity as we grow at scale to do it climate right?
Today, we have 137 companies in India have committed to become net zero.
The next step of growth capital that's needed often is not available in the quantity.
Designing for experience.
Yeah.
I think we design for infrastructure, but designing for
Yeah,
experience.
that's well put.
Climate finance has grown to 1.9 trillion US dollars globally. However, India needs 2.5 trillion US dollars to meet our 2030 targets. Solving for the climate finance challenge often feels like a six blind people and an elephant problem. There are multiple players in this ecosystem across VCs, DFIs, philanthropists, banks, and it is often unclear how all of these stakeholders come together to solve this challenge. One of the critical stakeholders in this ecosystem are development finance institutions who play a catalytic role in unlocking finance to solve this challenge at scale. Understanding the role they play and the value they add help us piece together the puzzle on what does it take to solve for climate change at scale. To help us do that, in today's episode of Decoding Impact, we have Shilpa Kumar, who is the Managing Director and Head of India at British International Investments. Shilpa, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to talk about climate a lot, but before I get there, people often don't understand the role of a DFI in an ecosystem. If you understand the funds and so on, if you can tell me a little bit more on what was the role they were playing earlier, and in the current environment in general, not just BII, what's the role of DFI looking like in the country today?
I think the words that best describe DFI capital is it's patient capital, it's very purpose-driven capital, it's flexible sometimes, and also it can really drive innovation and catalyze markets in different ways. And I think the role has changed over different times. So if I think back to BI's journey in India, our initial investments actually were in things like what you know today as Axis Bank. We invested in HDFC at a time when mortgage funding was still not as significant as it is today. We invested in the whole ecosystem for both venture as well as private equity. So we had a very different market shaping role earlier. I think today, given where the challenges are, in the world, I think definitely climate finance is critical. So climate finance is critical, inclusion is critical. Because again, the question is like in a country like India, which is large, which is growing fast, what's the role of a DFI? And the fact remains that there is, a substantial amount of population, which is still an aspiring population. And that's the population we wish to serve, to include through many different ways. So that's really the role. And, if I look at it, I was just looking at some statistics before coming in. There's a number that says, for example, for energy, just 1% of capital was DFI capital. But it's that crucial 1%. It's the 1% that really, A, takes early risks, B, eases the path for other lenders to come in and to mobilize capital, build partnerships on top of that. It's the 1% that will drive innovation. And, happy to talk a little bit more about, okay, what does that mean and what are those kind of investments we've made as we chat.
And I think we should, because for me also the big learning has always been that when the pipe is big enough, the throughput will come. But to make that pipe large enough, I think is going to be a very, very critical thing. But before we get to that, maybe just laying the field for climate finance itself. You know, I think it's like I was as I was reading the notes, and I realized it's like the Charles Dickens time of saying it's the good times and the bad times together, right? One, the money is flowing; it's 1.5 trillion globally, etc. But despite the huge flow, it's still not as much as we want it to be.
True.
We're still meeting only 30% of what India needs for its NDCs, etc. How would you characterize the climate finance ecosystem today?
So the first is, what's the total amount of climate finance the world needs? There's estimates saying 7 to 8 trillion a year. Right now it's about 1.5. That's the first gap. The second gap is and which countries are benefiting from it? There the numbers we have is 10 to 15% flows to emerging countries. The rest actually goes to more developed countries and China. Right. The third gap is, where is it going? And then again, if you look at, say, adaptation and resilience, correct, that number is closer to 10% or so. So that's like the first three gaps, that we kind of look at. But if you were to turn that around and say, okay, what's the lived experience? And particularly if you look at India in that context, I think there are a few things over there. First is, at 1.5 billion, we are a very large country. Number of people who get affected by climate events is very large.
Absolutely.
And in a sense, if you say that, okay, look, climate really hurts people at the bottom of the income chain the most, that's where we have a very significant population.
Right.
So that's like the first human cause. The second is really MSMEs. So when you look at MSMEs, which is the second piece, they're a third of the Indian economy. And if you look at their energy footprint, almost 80% is still driven by fossil fuel.
That's right.
The second is, the MSMEs really lack the technology, the ability to get the right technology, the ability to think of circularity of their waste, etc. So just addressing that piece, given that a large part of our economy is driven by self-employed, driven by small enterprises, I think that's the other really big gap. If you look at India, it's a large economy, growing fast, and also as it grows, really building out infrastructure. Yeah. And therefore, is there an opportunity as we grow at scale, that's right, to do it right, to do it climate right? So, the question is, as we build our ports, our buildings, our warehouses, our energy, are we doing it in a way that's friendly to the environment? And I think I'm comforted by two things over here. One is the government has shown ambition in this area.
Absolutely.
And they're doing it across different sectors, and we can talk about that. But also, I'm encouraged by the fact that we have this great entrepreneurial ecosystem where there's bright young minds waiting to solve problems and to do it, in India on the back of frameworks that we have over here. Right. So I think the combination of these things make India a very interesting place for climate finance.
Yeah, I want to tie this back to the 1% point that you made in the beginning.
Right.
Which is really that, an indeterminate risk is actually much worse than a known high risk.
Right.
Because once you know it's a high risk, you can price it accordingly. Yeah. Yeah. But when the markets don't know how much the risk is, they just don't know what to do with it.
Absolutely.
And for you to be able to put that patient capital, take that risk, provide that guarantee in some form through project financing makes a big difference. Yeah. And also the point that you made around playing the long game, which is making sure innovation happens and making sure that business markets are growing requires you to take a 10-year window. And very few capital today can actually take a 10-20-year window to solving these problems. So it sort of puts into context the point that you made earlier on the 1%. In some sense, when you look at some of these investments, Shilpa, what are some of the enabling conditions or tailwinds that you look for? Yeah. What I mean by that is, let's say in solar, government put in the right level of regulatory environment and the structures that can attract capital.
True.
Policy tailwinds were very strong, and like you said, there is entrepreneurial energy. How do you sort of look at tying up some of those other enabling conditions that are necessary for your financing to actually create value?
I think first, of course, the need and market, which one takes for granted. But then exactly what you mentioned. I think it's entrepreneurial energy, the policy environment, and maybe the third one will be deep liquid capital markets. And if you look at it, like as we are on this cusp of the global climate war, there are few places which are large battlegrounds on climate, but can also have an abundance of the remaining three criteria, which is liquid capital markets, entrepreneurs, and government policy that is supportive. Why that matters is, the opportunity presented by the combination of these four things. Like on the one hand, if you can support the right kind of entrepreneurs and solutions with the right kind of risk, the deep and liquid capital markets will then take it to scale.
Absolutely.
The second thing is, if government can support And it has shown, like 2-3 examples I told you, in each case there was a government intervention which helped make things happen. In generation, just introducing SECI as someone who will make payments on time was a big change. In electric mobility, FAME, which was subsidizing buses, was a big change. Today for rooftop solar, the PM Surya Ghar.
Yeah.
It's a big change. So what you need is this supportive government policy and good feedback loops. So the kind of hearing what industry has to say and kind of then changing policy to match it.
Right. In terms of mobility, one of the elements is really just a proliferation of just electric mobility solutions, etc.
Right.
But one of the areas that Sattva is today working on is also just the freight traffic space, which is, in terms of wheels on the ground, it's probably not as big, but in terms of emissions, it's huge.
Yeah.
Are you seeing sufficient momentum in all parts of mobility today? Because we see a lot more electric three-wheelers today in the market and two-wheelers in the market than in the freight space. Right. So just in terms of how you see that space overall, I think will be helpful as well.
We have actually invested in two-wheelers, three-wheelers, even in a sense looking at fleets, for buses. Those are the full range of solutions which we've looked at on the manufacturing side. In terms of sales, what we find is something which really helps in greater use of electric vehicles, and especially take financing, which plays such a big role.
Yeah.
That's where we intervene quite actively. The third area is really the ecosystem, because I just want to reference a book I read about the IT industry. Balakrishnan, I think, had co-authored it.
Okay.
And when you look back with the benefit of hindsight over like 30-40 years, you realize that the ecosystem got built in many different ways, and then like magic came together at a certain point in time for India to be the IT powerhouse it is today.
Right.
I think it's the same for even electric mobility, because on the one hand you have all this manufacturing happening, you have all this sales push happening, but then there's other stuff that's needed, and the other stuff is things like charging infrastructure. For instance, it is things like battery swapping. For electric mobility to succeed, on the one hand you need manufacturing, then you need reach and affordability for that reach, and lastly you need an ecosystem which will sustain. And like our portfolio across all of these things gives us really very powerful insights. But then the last thing is, how robust is this? Because again, we make this big leap into electric mobility, and we should not have traded off, say, oil risk for lithium risk.
Yes. What you've laid out as a good structure, right? Which is, how much money do we actually need? 2, is it going to the right places? 3, is it going for the right causes? And then there is that inclusion lens. If you just take the first thing, because honestly, I don't even have an imagination of 7.5 trillion. Like once it becomes a billion or a trillion, I'm like, okay, there's a lot of zeros. What are we actually investing in when we say climate finance? Like you touched upon infrastructure already.
Right.
I know there is a flywheel that's kicked off for solar and energy infrastructure in some sense. What else are we really talking about when we talk about climate finance?
Sure. I think you can look at it in 2 parts. One is which sectors, and the second is which products, and how do they make a difference. I think if you look at sectors, I mean, the best way to look at it is always what's polluting the environment.
Right.
And numbers are 50% energy, and then about 14 to 15% between mobility, industry, agriculture. So that's like the area that any financier in climate finance wants to cover. I think within energy, we see a lot of interest in renewables. Not just earlier we saw it in generation substantially, but now increasingly we are seeing it in transmission.
Okay.
And interestingly, also in the last mile of distribution. And I'll explain what that means. So the first, the first kind of investments you saw were really a lot in solar and wind. But then we, and speaking for ourselves, we've also invested in a platform to really drive transmission projects. Because on the one hand, you're getting energy, but you need to take it to where it belongs. The third area is ultimately, the power sector has long been troubled by the last mile of distribution, right? I mean, for people to take electricity and pay for it. There's a really big project which is unrolling across states, which is to do with installing smart meters. And that can have a very far-reaching impact because, you know, at one level, if you think about it, just like the way we are used to paying for our mobile, right, data. You can have a prepaid, you pay for it, you get your data.
Right.
I mean, can we reach a situation where you say, okay, I'll pay for my electricity and get it? Vis-a-vis today, where people often don't get electricity even if they're willing to pay for it. Simply because there's so much leakage in the distribution end. So there is, you know, those kind of projects which are currently, you know, rolling out. And I would say I used to do power sector financing a long time ago. And I'm deeply encouraged to think that indeed if distribution last mile gets solved, it can really change the sector.
Can you tell me a little bit more on distribution piece, Shilpa?
Yeah.
Like I understand the production piece, like install these large parks and stuff like that. What would investments in distribution mean? Is it just revamping the grid infrastructure a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's really how last mile electricity is delivered to people like us and every consumer in the country.
Right.
And the idea about, you know, smart meters is that you can then actually get much more detailed, accurate information on the energy that's being supplied. With that comes control on how it's delivered.
Okay.
So if you're paying for it, you get it. If you don't pay for it, you don't get it, you know, in a sense. But given that for so many years, one of the places we have just not been able to manage subsidies is the power sector.
Yeah.
And therefore, if we can get to a place where we understand a lot more about the consumer, maybe it can actually help change the health of the sector. So, like in everything, there's always a feedback loop and there are things to be fixed. So, you have to just be conscious of it. And right now, what's happening is the central government has come out with a scheme to encourage states to install smart meters. And there are entrepreneurs, and that's where it gets interesting. There is private capital which goes out, takes up this job for the government, and installs smart meters across different states.
Got it.
Where does climate finance play a role? In giving project finance for these kind of entities. That's the role for DFIs. To kind of come in to help with the initial rollout, and maybe once the rollout is done, to encourage banks who are then more than happy to actually come into the sector. So how does that work if you're going so significantly solar, but everything comes from somewhere else? And therefore the opportunity, and I think the opportunity was not just for India, but for the world, to have a place which can build out the vertical integration in solar in the country, because we were a large enough market to sustain it. So therefore another way, you know, to support that would be to really give equity to entrepreneurs who are willing to take the risk of setting up solar cell capacity.
Of course.
And that's another kind of investment that we've made, for example. So if you take a sector, you know, there's various ways to do it. One is the sector itself, then the robustness of the supply chains is the other part. And that's exactly the kind of thing which we've also done in electric mobility, agriculture, even in some areas in industry. So that's how climate finance comes in. On the other hand, there might be a very different need. So in 2015, 2017, we saw, for example, just to roll out solar projects, there was not sufficient entrepreneurial energy at that point in time. So we actually seeded a platform ourselves. So, you know, that's like taking a third kind of risk, which is we came in, we literally set up 100% platform, got a very good team to run it, and in a sense tried to build it out with the ambition of, you know, mobilizing both equity and debt capital, which then came almost, I would say, in the ratio of 1:20 by the end of it, to build out a 4 to 5 gigawatt kind of platform. And I think the more interesting thing is, because it was DFI backed, it was not just about building out a platform, it was about building it out to be the best in class ESG. You know, and it ranked actually #1 in Asia for its ESG footprint. So, you know, the ability therefore to come in and to support in different ways and to also do it in a way which supports the ESG footprint is what really interests us. The last way in which finance comes is the innovation capital. And there, what we do is we just support the venture capital industry because it's not easy for, let's say, DFIs to go out and take innovation risk.
Last time when I'd spoken to our mutual friend Bharat Pandey, we were talking about this idea that to build a solar plant in Germany is a lot cheaper than building it in Turkey. Even though the amount of sun Turkey might get is far higher than what Germany would get, because the inherent ability to absorb capital or the perceived risk in some of these countries is high. Is there a way to structurally reduce some of that inequity, and how do you see what needs to be done, not just as BII, but overall as well? If you look at it, how do you think we can sort of make this a little bit more equitable across countries?
I think the kind of partnerships you look for are different in different places. So in India, for example, because we have deep and liquid capital markets, it actually enables that if you take a certain risk, the ability to mobilize and leverage is much higher.
Right.
But if you look at a place like Africa, you might need to look for different kind of coalitions. So, for example, the DFIs themselves, are quite often able to present a coalition of sorts, like to invest at a first level. So the greater the risk, I think the greater that kind of capital that is needed to really drive things. I think the other area might be to look a lot more for local capital, because in India we see a lot of global capital also flowing in, which might not be available like in the Turkey case you mentioned, to really fund things over there. So then you need to look for more localized pools of capital. The third is really demonstration. I feel like if you can get something off the ground, demonstrate success, that's really what will attract maybe more capital than earlier. In the end, especially for the work we do in saying being the bridge to private capital, it has to be a bridge in a sense that crosses over. So otherwise the sustainability of private enterprise will not work. Then it needs to be government funded.
Even in terms of looking at where different countries are, let's say where India is today is maybe way better than where Africa is, for example, just in its ability to absorb capital. But I'm also thinking of it from the lens of the fact that India still only is getting 30% of the funding it needs to actually meet our NDCs in some form. If at an India scale, Shilpa, if you sort of look forward and say, hey, what do we need to put in place for us to both locally and globally attract more capital to come and solve this problem? Some part of it is just that, hey, the machine is going to catch up, like in the sense that we're doing all the right things and it's only a matter of time before we get it. But are there some discontinuities that you think we should invest in today? Saying if you do that now, we can actually unlock far more capital than what we are unlocking.
Let me just take a step back and say that sometimes some of these things sound easy but are really hard to execute. So and why they're hard to execute? Because it takes, at one level it's behavior change.
Right.
At another level it's, the solution being there. At a third level it's affordability. At a fourth level it's like what's the government doing? And all these factors have to come together to really, solve for it. And I think what's needed is different types of things to make different things happen. And I just want to illustrate that. I think the first gap we see is that innovation, the next step of growth capital that's needed, often is not available in the quantity that is required at that point in time. So there's a lot of, we just mapped, for example, the funds that are there in Indian ecosystem. There's many people working in the climate space in VC, which means that, you're really able to support bright young entrepreneurs who are doing stuff. But then when you shift a little bit to the right and you say, okay, who are the people who can write larger checks? Suddenly, that ecosystem dries up quite a lot.
Right.
So therefore the need for a little bit more of, funds who are playing the growth capital game, which is not easy. I mean, easier said than done, but that's where, one thing is needed. I think the second is really maybe, more efficient coalitions between existing pools of capital and risk-taking capital, which is, how to really mobilize mutual funds, banks, private credit, more seamlessly into newer ideas. And sometimes it might just be not knowing enough about something. So therefore, how do we make sure that the risks are sufficiently, experienced and can be shared? The third can be just looking at market disruptions, because sometimes for the long game, you need to be able to take a market through disruptions.
Right.
For example, in the financial sector today. And therefore being able to come into spaces both with debt and equity, which can then take you out and provide you kind of the lifeline to a sustained future.
Right.
So there's many different kinds of things I would say that are needed at this point in time.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, because what you're saying is that let's not just harp on the total number.
Yeah.
It's also the nature of the capital.
Yeah, very true.
Capital across different buckets that I think is important, and it's very gladdening to know that the VC capital is starting to grow. There is interest and momentum and confidence in the entrepreneurial energy in the company, but really that replication money that we need for it to grow, I think is missing. Sattva has also been working, Shilpa, is in the space of innovation. One of the things that we are seeing is that there is this R&D space, not the VC space. The R&D space where we have to focus on much more deeper tech innovations, etc., that may have a longer window, and usually has been state sponsored, etc.
Right.
Is that a potential area that you think needs investment as well, or do you feel like in the journey of climate, that's not as important today for us overall? And I'm saying this especially keeping in mind the point you talked about, the robust supply chains that we need to have.
Yeah.
Because in some sense we are sort of importing a bunch of things today to build this.
Yeah.
But would love to hear your thoughts there as well.
Definitely it's something to invest in, but also we have to be cognizant it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time.
Right.
I think though we are blessed with a number of research and technical institutions which are able to actually provide that knowledge skill set.
That's right.
So I think that's to build on. And you might not make the big leap immediately, right? I mean, so for example, from solar panels, you first go to modules, then cells, then you think about, okay, what does it take to make a cell? So it need not be like the big jump. It can also be a bit more linear in terms of where your research takes you.
Right.
And I think each kind of push is actually a push forward, and it can be a brand new way of doing things, which I'm sure research institutes are also focused on. But it can also be just incrementally changing what we can do.
Yeah.
And you have to do it at scale and at price.
Correct.
So
Correct.
all of this work, I see a lot of things going on, and I think it's quite encouraging.
Excellent. I want to move to the third part of our conversation, which I think is very close to my heart, which is the question of resilience and adaptation. Like you said, it's just 10% of the money today. There's a significant investment in mitigation, etc. But maybe tell us a little bit more about it. Where is the money going? Where should it actually go?
Yeah.
How do you see it?
I just want to walk a little bit back to a lady I met who was part of an investment which we made. So at a macro level, what was this investment? At a macro level, this investment was us investing in organic dairy farming. So there was an entrepreneur who felt there was a need. Bangalore had many people who wanted to move into consuming a better quality of milk. The entrepreneur was identifying families who had a certain plot of land, because you can't do it on very small land, who had a certain size plot of land and who would be willing to go the journey with him.
Right.
The lady I met, she lived with her husband, and together they, got into a partnership with the company and started rearing cows for milk. They began with, I think, 1 or 2 cows, and today they actually have a very significant stock. Income has gone up from like 15,000 per month to about 1.5 lakh per month. The house she stays in has gone from being a kacha house to being a 2-storied concrete structure. And more importantly, which is where we come to the climate journey, the emissions from the milk which was being produced through this organic dairy farming has actually gone down substantially, the emissions. The second thing is, because of the way they were using waste and how they were getting their fodder, growing their fodder, the soil quality over a 10-year journey actually has gone up 8 times in terms of what you call SOC, which is the organic carbon in soil. So like the point of this story is, and I really feel, touched by it and inspired by it, because on the one hand, it's a story about mitigation, it's a story about ANR, adaptation and resilience, it's a story about inclusion, and it's a story about how a young woman who, was actually staring at an unproductive piece of land has actually a family where the two daughters studied, the older one went to MBA school. When I met her, she very proudly told me, my daughter worked for a few years and said, I want to come back and do this business. So I can tell you, for example, another story which was in Asia, very different. So this was a power plant, wind power in a delta area, where the river meets the sea. And there were a lot of mangroves there, but also because of coastal erosion, there was instability for both the power plant as well as instability for the ecosystem.
Right.
And this is something which we invested in, and we actually, kind of got a lot of effort into the mangrove restoration. And what that does is, mangrove restoration both supported not just the environment there and helped, reduce the soil erosion, but also actually supported the ability to generate sustainably wind power in that area. I think the other point I want to make is it's not cleanly in buckets of ANR or cleanly in buckets of mitigation. Sometimes there are things, where you get a confluence of the two as well, which are very interesting.
Right. And I mean, this is an interesting perspective on adaptation and resilience from, what I had in mind. So let me just flesh this out a little bit. One part of what you're saying is that in just doing mitigation, there are positive unintended consequences or intended consequences that support adaptation. There is also addressing the adaptation risk for mitigation interventions, like this windmill being able to stand, the wind power plant being able to stand, and so on as well. And I know, given the role you play, Shilpa, and given the role of DFIs in general, fixing for market failures is really the core, right?
Yeah.
Do you see a way to sort of address market failures at risk for adaptation resilience as well overall? Because a lot of times it becomes a state capacity problem.
I would argue also, like, what's the idea to back? See, in the end, like when you look at, like, DFIs are interesting animals, right? Because in the end, we are looking to back private capital with a bridge to somewhere. I mean, like, in the end, it has to be not state energy, but private energy, which can drive an idea and also take it to a sustainable life. I mean, that's the two things. And therefore, I think at a first level, it's also about finding the right solution. And that's why our focus on VC funds, and, we've recently invested, for example, in Thea Ventures, whose whole focus, Priya's focus is a little bit on really finding, brand new ideas for climate solutions. Find a bridge to somewhere and then really back them for scale. I think also, the role of government, honestly, will be very important in what they encourage, because then the market case also comes out of a little bit what the government is encouraging. So I think it's both of these things to my mind.
But maybe I'll play a thought experiment, right? Like, one of the issues that I care deeply about is urban heat. We've been working in that space, and we know that heat is actually reducing productivity.
Right.
Creating economic losses because construction workers are stopping work, dwellers and diamond cutters, etc. are stopping work as well. So these are examples of, let's say, where heat is causing economic productivity loss. So there is probably going to be willingness in businesses to find solutions for heat loss, right? And there are organizations that are working on cooling solutions, roofing solutions, all of that stuff.
Fair enough.
Hence, there is probably an opportunity to say, hey, this is a market play. Like, the state doesn't have to sort of fix every roof in some sense. Maybe there is a market opportunity to look at cooling solutions. Will this be of interest to you as a DFI?
Very much, very much. And one of the ways which I so far haven't touched upon where we work is directed lending. So, like, how do you drive finance into ways you want?
Right.
I actually saw a paper by, one of the other DFIs where they've intervened in a very significant way to support standards for, housing. And, like, some of the standards are very simple things, how you place windows in a house, for instance. And if you say to a financial institution that if you follow these standards, here's some money, which if you meet the right set of lending standards, we are willing to give you either for longer tenures or greater size, and in some cases with some incentive to make that work.
Right.
So that's actually area of great interest for us. Like, how do you get resilient products, things that change the quality of our life upfront.
So that's interesting, because then for us to then look at what are market-led models for solving for some of these, and the ability to attract the patient capital that's required, there is intent to at least give that.
Yeah.
Related point, Shilpa, is also the question of, let's say, market infrastructure. Like, one of the things that I often think about is the carbon offset infrastructure, the carbon credit infrastructure. Today we have 137 companies in India have committed to become net zero. They know that investing in restoration, etc., to be able to offset some of their emissions is critical. And there are a large number of organizations in India today that are investing in restoration work on the ground. But the absence of an effective market infrastructure that can sort of price quality of restoration, etc., is a challenge. As somebody at a DFI level, would creating that market infrastructure be something of interest to you and something you could look at?
When you say restoration, I think you mean the broader chain, like just better climate practices, right? Yeah, let me give you an illustration of rooftop solar, for example. Like, at one level, it's the best thing, right? Every person with their own house can have their little energy plant on the roof, and over a period of time, actually cheaper than your electricity bill. So, like, it's a very compelling case. But what's the problem? Problem is, like, it's so complicated that you don't know who's the right provider. How do you get it on top? How do you fund it? Because you might save on your electricity bill, but it requires bigger funding right now. How do you maintain it? And that's where, again, I go back, entrepreneurship comes in. So we're looking at two companies, one of which is really a marketplace. So it's a marketplace which tells you, okay, these are the people who provide rooftop solar, and these are the people who provide funding, these are the people who will do your maintenance. And this is how we'll monitor what's going on in your little energy plant on top of your roof. So, like, if there's this whole marketplace in effect available on your phone, that gives you the access, availability of people who look to fund this. And that's one of the things also we are looking at. We are looking at a player who actually does completely digital sourcing of funding. So you don't need to go anywhere. You need to, essentially provide everything over, digital means to this company, and they will look at providing you funding.
Right.
And if you think about it, this gives both understanding, access, and affordability all in one place. And if we support, like, these entrepreneurs, both, through provision of equity, through provision of debt, then you can scale all of this. The last thing, and of course this is anecdotal, I don't think it happens everywhere, but one of the things I heard when I was talking to a housing finance company, they were talking about a particular block in their state, and they said ever since PM Surya Ghar has come, very active interest taken by the local bureaucracy. Every time they found out someone's building a house, to proactively say, why don't you consider rooftop solar?
Right.
So, I think it's a combination of things which have to get it right, but I feel big steps are happening in this area.
Just a little tangent though, when you talked about the rooftop solar example, one of the things that has also held people back is its transaction costs.
Yeah.
Just every house having a rooftop solar. Some of the work that we are actually doing on the unified energy interface, Shilpa, with the Beacon protocol.
Right.
Much like UPI for payment interface, how can we have an energy interface, etc. And some of the costs around billing, visibility, traceability, etc. can be solved. And I do feel that at some point, and I know it's still nascent, at some point that public infrastructure digitally for enabling energy transactions, I think can create just a far more higher entrepreneurial energy for solving these problems as well.
No, I agree with you, and of course I'd be interested to know more about what you're doing there. But I think we saw it in finance, right? I mean, with the whole framework, JAM, Jandhan Aadhaar Mobile, actually changed payments in the country. And the same way, I think we have scope to change energy. And when you just step back and think about it, on the one hand, you're seeing, like we said, generation happening in different ways, transmission, consumption happening in different ways. And then when you think about, this whole marketplace becoming a much bigger one, I think there's a lot of opportunity over there.
I think so too. Yeah. And I think we're literally at the cusp of that innovation, I feel. That a lot more exciting things are going to come our way once some of these rails are getting set up.
True.
More fundamentally.
True.
I wanted to come back to one point that you made in the beginning around the MSMEs and, and just the scale. Today actually I was flying down and it's this visible sight whenever it rains and you come down to Bombay, it's just a range of blue.
Yeah.
Right? You have the blue roofs over and over. And it always strikes me to say just the scale of the problem we are solving. Like just the number of MSMEs, it's 98.6, etc. Right? Like of all the enterprises in the country. Do you have some thoughts on how do we solve for this scale as well, Shilpa? Because the point that you made beyond the three challenges was also just this diffusion and the focus on inclusion.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of speak to you about that to say solving at scale for some of these.
Yeah.
How do you sort of think about that?
So I think it's about really the accessibility of solutions. First you have to have a solution which speaks to that price point.
Right.
Then you have to have people being aware of it and then being able to, afford it. I think it just boils down to that.
Right.
Because the trouble is a lot of the MSME space works in the somewhat informal space.
Yeah.
I mean, the informality is to do with where their place of work is, it's to do with how they conduct business.
Yeah.
And therefore, like just regulation will not, drive it.
Correct.
It has to be something which really speaks to the economics of what is being done.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an illustration. We were talking to one of our, investees about what if we took your entire dealership system and let's chat about what it means, vendors, MSME vendors to become, green vendors, which you're reducing your water footprint, reducing your energy footprint, that kind of thing. And one of the things I learned was, for a lot of them, their place of work was not their own, or it was, an informal space, and all that makes it hard to build on. So I feel the MSME has unique problems, and you have to address those unique problems. But at the same time, if it speaks to the economics of what's happening, it will get done.
I think a couple of things that I've been thinking about, right? One that I've been thinking about is today when I speak to large companies, there's a lot of incentive to do the right thing. They attract capital at a lower rate if they do the right thing. They have commitments that they make, etc. Sometimes those incentives don't translate to MSMEs themselves, right? Like the MSMEs neither have carrots nor sticks to be able to change behavior. And so one of the questions is how do we sort of cascade these incentives for going green to MSMEs in some sense, because most of the time I feel like they are sledgehammer things that there's a ruling from the court saying all bakeries have to become green in Bombay now.
Yeah.
That's a sledgehammer, right? The incentive structures are not set up.
Yeah.
Second is I wonder whether the entrepreneurial energy that we have to solve for some of the larger infra problems can be channeled to solving for at volume MSME problems as well, because customer acquisition costs are high, ability to pay is low. So you sort of, to channel that, I feel like in what we were discussing earlier, what rails can we build that make some of these things easier for people, I think is critical as well. Third is I agree with you that embracing informality as a feature and not a bug, right? Saying, okay, if this is the context and this is where we're working, how do we design within that? Because I don't think that formalization is going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen, but it's going to be a long run. So how do we look at it? So one of the ideas that we've been toying as well is that rather than looking at MSME as a unit, can we look at a cluster as a unit?
Yeah.
Right? That just gives you just a volume to be able to look at this, and that has its own economics of solving for a cluster than solving for a unit. And we've been thinking about it in the textile space, for example.
Yeah.
And so things like that are what we are thinking of. But unless they move, I don't think India is going to move. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about is really around where the capital starts to flow as well, right? One, today we talk about India as a unit, but more and more we realize that different states are in different places. Cities are becoming engines of growth as well.
Right.
And there is also the question of not state capacity at the country level, but state capacity at a state level and sometimes at a city level as well. How does that reflect into the work that you're doing?
That's really a very big question, right? Because in the end, we're a federal structure.
Yeah.
And I think the ambition of the central government in terms of policy, kind of suggesting things is there. But then in the end, it is really for the states to execute. And therefore, the role of states is super important in this climate journey. I would say even more important, just given the fact that bulk of our population is going to be living in cities. Even more important is the role of cities.
Yeah.
Because that's where I would say really the maximum conflict between growth, human and ecosystem kind of comes to the fore, right? Because there's a pressure on all kinds of resources, and therefore we absolutely need to solve for what happens in the city. The second thing is, just reflecting again on the fact that cities are going to be a big part of it.
Yeah.
That's where all the big infrastructure is also getting built.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if the climate right infra is not done, you actually will be stuck with then, infrastructure which you can't do anything about, and which will weigh down on the environment footprint of the city for a very long time to come.
Yeah.
And therefore, what happens with cities is as important as what happens with states. I'm kind of encouraged, we saw work which was being done, for example, by the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, where they actually started looking at climate budgeting.
Right.
Trying to see what footprint every part of the budget really had for climate. Also encouraged by things we've seen in Orissa, which, as you know, is a cyclone-prone state. The way they have actually introduced climate budgeting and kind of try to reflect, how resilient infrastructure at a state level should be, and how they can bounce back from, disasters like cyclones. Kerala has done something similar. So I think the idea is, as states also evolve, I think very important to see how they execute on it. While there's finance available globally for these things, it's not easy to access. Because if you want to access global finance, I'm talking about cities and states, you need to have a paper that kind of outlines things in a certain way, makes sense to the funders who will look at it, and often needs hand-holding of a very different kind.
And I think just building on your point, for me, infrastructure is such an irreversible choice. You build it, it's hopefully it's going to stay for 20, 30 years, and 20, 30 years is a lifetime in our current context.
True.
And recently I was working with one of our clients that we are working with, and we clearly saw the difference in the tier 1 cities like the Mumbais and the Bangalores of the world, which maybe are not doing enough, but there is an ecosystem around them. Then you look at the Jalandhars of the world, the Ludhianas of the world that are building, and they're building fast.
Exactly.
These cities are becoming larger as we see them, and sort of self-organizing in sort of suboptimal structures, where some of these conversations are still not there, and the capacity at the city level or the urban level, urban municipality level to be able to take it is still very, very low. And often it requires a state plus city approach. So the point that you're making about building their capacity to even attract the capital to solve for this, build the vision for it, build the coalition around them, I think is very, very important. How do you see philanthropy coming in to work with DFI? Like, are there partnership models where you say that, hey, here's a great complement to what philanthropy does to what you're currently doing in BII?
No, I think there's a really big role, because if you look at like what philanthropic capital, the role it can play, it can be a variety of things. At one level, it can just be building greater understanding, on what's going on. And there are so many different parts of what's happening right now that also moving at speed. And we need a feedback loop to know, is this the right thing or not? Secondly, what we just spoke about, because in the end, private capital addresses only a part of the equation. There's a lot of large expenditure which will happen by the government. And are they having the right, in a sense, information and capabilities to help design for the future? So I feel that's another role that can be played over there. I think the third is really just taking a topic and giving it wider attention, throwing a spotlight on it. I think that's like a third area. And the fourth is, of course, coming on even earlier in terms of risks, which need to be taken to kind of suss out different kind of interventions which can be successful and which can be scaled up into a business wide intervention. So I feel like philanthropy can play a really critical role.
And I think the idea of just holding the mirror calling out the risks, identifying the opportunities, etc. And the second is building the field, right?
Right.
Just in terms of building state capacity,
True.
that's important. I want to talk about two examples where this intersection may be very prevalent, but get your thoughts as well. One is jobs. I constantly feel like that's one of the biggest crises that we face as a country, just next to climate maybe, you know, and in terms of what it means for young people, etc. We spoke about entrepreneurial energy, that I think is a prerequisite for creating jobs. I think any market that sees entrepreneurial energy will eventually create jobs. But in your work, are you able to see pathways for job creation to happen in some of the investments that you're making in across energy, mobility, agriculture and so on?
Yeah, one of the things we use to measure every investment is what we call our PSI score. You know, productive, sustainable, inclusive. And productive is really about measuring the jobs and what kind of jobs. And one of the things we also lean into is gender. So we also kind of track, you know, how many women's jobs are created. So these things are really important to us. Now, it also begs the question that, okay, when philanthropy plays a role, is this an area, you know, where also philanthropy can lean in? So that's, you know, the second. The third is really gender. So, you know, always, you know, the push we have is, and what does it mean for the kind of jobs that are available with women? So, for example, I mean, just to give you an idea, we are doing a number of investments in, say, the financial space. And as you well know, that a lot of times the jobs for women are those which are at head office or central roles. But we are really, you know, trying to understand what will it take to also get more on-field roles in the financial services sector. So I'll say there's a number of things at work here. You know, we are one of the founders, and, you know, one of the things we look for is the 2x challenge.
Right.
So really, for every investment we make, looking at, you know, how many, what's the role of women across the, in a sense, value chain, both of jobs, management, etc. So that's one of the things we actually track in our investments. And like I said, the last thing is we also track a total number of jobs.
Got it, got it. And then I think the point that you made around the confluence of philanthropy, just to know that there is a job for which there are no people. In a country where so many people are looking for jobs, it's just a supply-demand mismatch. And even just sharing that signal with philanthropy to build human capital, because yesterday I was with a CSR leader who was willing to sign a 150 crore check to invest in people capacity building. And the question that he had is, where are the jobs that require that skill premium that can take families out of intergenerational poverty?
We should get them to talk.
Exactly. And my thinking is that, hey, these supply side signals are what is missing. You know, saying here is the supply of jobs, and on the demand side, we're sort of wading in the dark and doing retail hospitality training. And I think if there is a way to make it meet, I think it will be very helpful. Shilpa, if you had a magic wand, and if there were like 3 things that you wish were very different in India today for us to accelerate this journey much farther, what would those 3 things be?
Let me just focus on one, honestly. I think it's all about execution. Like, in the end, you can have the best policies, you can have people wanting to finance, but in the end, it all boils down to execution. And I feel in execution, the hardest element is always the last mile. So how do you get that last mile done? And like, I'll, you know, start with a, you know, close to home example, like Mumbai Metro. Fantastic. It's a, you know, really great piece of infrastructure delivered to the city. And it's electric, it's convenient, it saves time, it can change the way people work. But literally the last mile is now where we need to get it right, you know, like in the sense that, okay, we all must, you know, get used to traveling by metro, and I tried it and it was a great ride. But the moment you get off at the station, like what takes you to your home and how efficiently? Because if that breaks down, you know, you're not going to get the behavior change you want. And I think if you think about, you know, everything, it's really the last mile in every part of what we do that's so important. Because we can, you know, really build big industries, we can, you know, have lots of solutions, but in the end it's about behavior change, it's about how we respond. And I therefore, my real wish is the focus on last mile and good execution.
I agree with you. And I'm just designing for experience.
Yeah.
I think we design for infrastructure, but designing for
Yeah,
experience.
that's well put. Yeah, I agree with you.
Before we close, Shilpa, I would love to sort of take a more forward-looking view. Like we said, this is really designing for the future. It's not as much about solving the problem to say, are we building for the future? So if I had to take like a 2030 postcard for the work on climate finance, what would your 2030 postcard look like?
It takes me back to a trip I took in Arunachal Pradesh. And like at one level it might seem like, okay, this was an area where, development had not happened at all. But at the same time, when you looked at the lives that people were leading, one thing that stood out for me is the deep respect that they had for the environment in which they lived. So you wanted to live a good life, you wanted to earn money, but you also wanted to be very respectful of the environment in which you were. And at one level I thought to myself, someone might argue development has passed them by, but maybe at another level one could argue for good reason, because they still had like the very basics of life, which is clean water, clean air, green environment, something that, sustain not just the body and the soul. So sorry, I'm going a bit philosophical, but you asked for, what my vision and wish was.
Of course.
And I think that's really what every human needs. And sometimes we just don't know it, because in our desire, for a more material, better life, in our desire for a more material, better income, we actually forget that there is, the bigger planet is as much, who we are as it is, us. So really, I would feel like a world where we are more respectful of the broader ecosystem and environment.
That's very beautifully said. And I think sometimes you're right that we create a problem and sort of palpitate around how to solve for it ourselves. Maybe my vision, when I was thinking of, I don't know if you've read this book, If I Were Rain. It's a book where children are asked saying, if I were rain, what would I be? And there's a quote that I found very interesting, which says, if I were rain, I'll go to places where water cannot go today. Okay. And a lot of times I feel that way about climate finance or finance in general, right? Which is, it's not as much about the amount of rain, it's about where that rain is able to get to.
True.
And just our ability to create a fertile ground for people to create value for themselves through the finance that can reach them. And we spoke about state to city, but even just a city to household. Right? How do we build the agency of the ground to be able to absorb and create value out of capital? I think if we can do that for the whole of India by 2030, it's possible. I think that will be my wish card.
That's great, and that was lovely. Thank you, Rathish.
Thank you, Shilpa.